October 21st, 1805. Admiral Horatio Nelson stood on the deck of HMS Victory, watching 33 enemy ships form a line of battle stretching for miles. He had 27. The mathematics were brutal. If this went wrong, Napoleon could invade England within weeks. If it went right, if everything went exactly as planned, Britain might never face naval threat again. Nelson had already written his will. He'd made his peace. Now he had one more order to give, a signal that would either inspire his fleet to impossible victory or be remembered as the last words of a dead admiral whose boldness had destroyed the Royal Navy. This is Trafalgar, where 27 ships faced 33 in a battle that would decide who ruled the seas, where one admiral's audacious plan would either save Britain or doom it, and where victory and death became inseparable in ways no one expected. Welcome to Britain's history. Today, we're diving into the most decisive naval battle ever fought, a fight where Britain's survival hung in the balance, where one admiral's tactical genius overcame superior numbers, and where victory and tragedy became inseparable. Because Trafalgar wasn't just about ships and cannons. It was about one man's willingness to die for his country, and a navy's determination to rule the waves no matter the cost. But before we get to that legendary signal, before we watch victory lead the line into point-blank cannon fire, we need to understand how Britain and France reached this point. Because without knowing why Napoleon needed to destroy the Royal Navy, you can't truly appreciate what was at stake when those ships opened fire on October the 21st, 1805. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into history, make sure you're subscribed. We've got dozens more forgotten battles lined up, each one as dramatic as Trafalgar. Don't miss them. Let's go back to 1803, when Britain and France resumed the war that had consumed Europe for a decade. The Peace of Amiens, signed in 1802, had given both nations a brief respite, but it was always temporary. Napoleon Bonaparte, now First Consul and soon to be Emperor, had ambitions that terrified Britain. He'd conquered most of continental Europe. He'd reorganized France, created new legal codes, and established himself as the most powerful ruler since Charlemagne. And he wanted to invade Britain. Britain's advantage was simple but overwhelming: the Royal Navy. As long as British warships controlled the Channel, Napoleon's Grande Armée, the finest military force in Europe, couldn't cross the 20 miles of water separating France from England. Napoleon had 200,000 soldiers camped at Boulogne, waiting for the order to invade. But they needed naval superiority, even briefly, to make the crossing. Without it, British ships would destroy the invasion barges mid-channel and drown Napoleon's dreams of conquest. Napoleon's strategy was to lure the Royal Navy away from the Channel, then concentrate his own fleets for one decisive crossing. He ordered the French Mediterranean Fleet, under Admiral Villeneuve, to escape Toulon, sail to the West Indies, draw British ships across the Atlantic in pursuit, then race back to Europe and unite with the French and Spanish fleets at Brest. This combined fleet, potentially 50 or 60 ships of the line, would overwhelm whatever British forces remained in the Channel, giving Napoleon the hours he needed to land his army in England. It was a brilliant plan. It almost worked. Admiral Villeneuve escaped Toulon in April 1805 and sailed to Martinique in the West Indies. Nelson, commanding the Mediterranean fleet, pursued him across the Atlantic. For weeks, the two fleets played cat and mouse in the Caribbean. Nelson searched desperately for Villeneuve, always just missing him. Meanwhile, Napoleon's timeline was working. British ships were dispersed. The Channel might soon be vulnerable. But Villeneuve lost his nerve. Instead of waiting for other French squadrons to join him as planned, he panicked and sailed back to Europe earlier than Napoleon intended. Nelson, realizing he'd been decoyed, raced back across the Atlantic. By July, both fleets were back in European waters. But Napoleon's grand strategy had failed. The British hadn't been drawn away long enough. The moment for invasion had passed. Napoleon, furious with Villeneuve's timidity, ordered him to break out of Cadiz, where the combined French-Spanish fleet had taken refuge. Napoleon no longer expected to invade England, but he needed the fleet to support operations in Italy. Villeneuve, stung by Napoleon's criticism and knowing he was about to be relieved of command in disgrace, made a desperate decision. He would sail out and fight the British fleet he knew was waiting. Perhaps a victory would redeem his reputation. Perhaps he'd be killed and avoid the shame of dismissal. Either way, his career was over unless he did something bold. On October 19th, 1805, the combined Franco-Spanish fleet left Cadiz heading for the Mediterranean. 33 ships of the line, 18 French and 15 Spanish, under Villeneuve's command. The fleet was impressive on paper, but riddled with problems. French and Spanish crews didn't train together. Many sailors were inexperienced conscripts. Some Spanish ships were undermanned. Communication between Allied commanders was poor. It was a fleet thrown together by political necessity, not naval logic. Nelson was waiting with 27 British ships of the line. He'd been blockading Cadiz for weeks, positioned just over the horizon to watch for exactly this moment. When his frigates signaled that the enemy was leaving port, Nelson knew his chance had come. This was the battle he'd been seeking for months. The opportunity to destroy Napoleon's naval power once and for all. He ordered his fleet to intercept Villeneuve off Cape Trafalgar, a headland on Spain's southwestern coast. Think about this for a moment. You're a British sailor in October 1805. You're outnumbered 33 ships to 27. You're sailing toward an enemy who has every advantage of position. Your admiral has just explained a battle plan that involves sailing directly at enemy guns for 30 minutes before you can fire back. You know many of you will die in the next few hours. Would you trust Nelson enough to follow him into that hell? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Nelson's plan was audacious and unconventional. Traditional naval tactics called for fleets to form parallel lines and exchange broadsides, ships sailing alongside each other, firing their cannons. It was formal, predictable, and indecisive. Battles often ended with both fleets withdrawing after hours of long-range gunnery that damaged ships without destroying them. Nelson hated this cautious approach. He wanted total victory, complete destruction of the enemy fleet, and he was willing to risk everything to get it. His plan was to attack in 2 columns perpendicular to the enemy line. Instead of sailing parallel to Villeneuve's fleet, Nelson would drive his ships straight at the Franco-Spanish line, breaking through it at 2 points. This meant his leading ships would be under concentrated enemy fire for perhaps 30 minutes before they could return fire effectively. They'd be raked, hit by broadsides that would tear through their bows, killing dozens with each shot. It was the most dangerous position a sailing warship could be in. But once through the enemy line, British ships would be among the Franco-Spanish fleet, able to engage at close range where superior British gunnery would dominate. The enemy's organized line would be broken into a chaotic melee where individual ship quality mattered more than numerical advantage. Nelson was gambling that his ship's better training, faster gun crews, and superior seamanship would overcome the numbers disadvantage. He was probably right, but the cost would be enormous. On the morning of October 21st, the two fleets sighted each other off Cape Trafalgar. Light winds meant movement was slow. Both sides had hours to prepare for the coming battle. Nelson made his rounds on Victory, speaking with officers and crew, ensuring they understood the plan. He was wearing his admiral's uniform with all his medals and decorations, making himself an obvious target for enemy marksmen. His officers begged him to cover the decorations or change coats. Nelson refused. He would go into battle as an admiral should. At 11:40 a.m., Nelson ordered his famous signal hoisted. England expects that every man will do his duty. It ran through the fleet ship to ship, sailors reading it and cheering. Some thought it magnificent. Others thought it unnecessary. Of course they'd do their duty. But it became instantly iconic, the perfect expression of British naval tradition and national determination. England expected. Her sailors would deliver or die trying. At noon, the battle began. Nelson's flagship Victory led one column directly toward the Franco-Spanish center. Admiral Collingwood in Royal Sovereign led the second column toward the enemy rear. Both ships were sailing into a storm of cannon fire, unable to respond effectively until they broke through the enemy line. Sailors on Victory watched enemy ships ahead of them, counting the minutes until they'd be in range. Then the firing started. French and Spanish ships opened up with everything they had. Cannonballs tore through Victory's sails and rigging. Shots smashed into her hull, sending splinters flying that killed and maimed more effectively than the balls themselves. Men fell around Nelson. His secretary was cut in half by a cannonball. Nelson kept pacing the deck, refusing to take cover, watching his ship approach the enemy line while death flew around him. Victory took 30 minutes of fire before she could effectively respond. By then, she'd suffered significant damage and casualties. But she crashed through the enemy line just astern of Villeneuve's flagship Bucentaure, raking her with a devastating broadside that killed or wounded 400 men in seconds. Then Victory engaged the French ship Redoutable at point-blank range. So close, the ships were touching. Sailors fighting across the decks, Marines firing muskets from the rigging. At 1:15 p.m., Nelson was shot. A French marksman in Redoutable's rigging, firing down onto Victory's deck, hit Nelson in the left shoulder. The musket ball traveled through his body, piercing his spine and lung. Nelson fell, caught by a Marine and two sailors. His last words as they carried him below: "They've done for me at last. My backbone is shot through." For the next 3 hours, Nelson lay dying in Victory's cockpit while the battle raged above. He asked constantly for reports. Was the fleet winning? How many enemy ships captured? Were his captains following the plan? The surgeon could do nothing. Spinal wounds were inevitably fatal with 19th century medicine. All they could do was make Nelson comfortable and wait. He knew he was dying, He'd expected it. Now he wanted to know if his death had brought victory. Meanwhile, the battle had become exactly the melee Nelson intended. British ships, having broken through the enemy line, engaged at close range where their superior gunnery dominated. British gun crews could fire faster, aim better, and maintain discipline under pressure better than their French and Spanish opponents. Ship after ship of the combined fleet was battered into submission. Some struck their colours after hours of punishment. Others were boarded and captured in hand-to-hand fighting. A few exploded when magazines ignited. The Franco-Spanish fleet was disintegrating. Villeneuve, his flagship Bucentaure, dismasted and defenceless, surrendered. Spanish Admiral Gravina, in Príncipe de Asturias, fought bravely, but was mortally wounded. Individual French and Spanish ships showed tremendous courage. Redoutable, which had killed Nelson, fought until 300 of her 640 crew were casualties. But courage couldn't overcome the systematic destruction British gunnery and tactics inflicted. By 4:30 p.m., the battle was effectively over. 18 Franco-Spanish ships had surrendered or would surrender shortly. 4 more had been destroyed. Only 11 escaped, fleeing toward Cadiz in disorder. The British hadn't lost a single ship, but the human cost was enormous. British casualties were about 1,700 killed and wounded. Victory alone had 159 casualties. Franco-Spanish losses were catastrophic. Over 4,000 dead, 2,500 wounded, and 7,000 captured. Half their fleet was gone in 6 hours. At 4:30 p.m., Nelson died. His last words, reported by those present: "Thank God I have done my duty." Or possibly, "Kiss me, Hardy," speaking to his flag captain, Thomas Hardy. The exact words are disputed, but the meaning was clear. Nelson died knowing he'd won. His last request was that his body be taken home to England for burial, not buried at sea, as was naval custom. He wanted the nation to see what victory had cost. The news of Trafalgar reached England on November 6, 1805. The nation erupted in celebration and grief simultaneously. Victory was total. Napoleon's naval power was destroyed. Invasion was impossible. British naval supremacy was unchallenged. But Nelson was dead. The hero who'd made it possible killed at the moment of his greatest triumph. Britain had won everything and lost the man they loved most. The strategic consequences were immense. Napoleon would never again seriously threaten to invade Britain. The Royal Navy could blockade French ports, strangle French trade, and support British operations worldwide without fear of challenge. British commerce flourished. British colonies were secure. For the next 100 years, Britain would dominate the seas so completely that Britannia rules the waves became simple fact, not just patriotic song. The psychological impact was equally significant. Nelson became Britain's greatest naval hero, the embodiment of courage, tactical brilliance, and self-sacrifice. His death elevated him from successful admiral to national saint. Trafalgar Square, Nelson's column. Countless ships named Victory or Nelson. His memory became woven into British national identity in ways few historical figures achieve. From a French perspective, Trafalgar was catastrophe compounded by humiliation. Not only was the fleet destroyed, but it was destroyed attempting a mission Napoleon had already abandoned. Villeneuve died in 1806, possibly by suicide, unable to face the shame of his defeat. Napoleon never forgave the Navy's failure, focusing his energies entirely on land warfare, where his genius could shine unencumbered by admirals who disappointed him. For Spain, Trafalgar was tragic. Spanish ships and sailors had fought bravely as France's ally, suffering enormous casualties for a French strategic goal. Spanish naval power, once formidable, was broken at Trafalgar and never recovered. Spain's ability to maintain its vast American empire was fatally weakened. Within 20 years, Spanish colonies would rebel, knowing Spain lacked the naval power to suppress them. Trafalgar's consequences echoed through decades of Latin American independence movements. Modern historians debate aspects of Trafalgar endlessly. Was Nelson's plan brilliant or reckless? Brilliant, most agree. It achieved total victory against superior numbers. But the casualties British ships took breaking through the enemy line were enormous. A more conventional approach might have won with fewer losses. Nelson gambled that decisive victory was worth the cost. He was right, but he paid with his life. Was Nelson's death necessary? He made himself a target by wearing his uniform and decorations, by pacing victory's deck exposed to enemy fire, by refusing to take elementary precautions. Some argue this was foolish vanity that deprived Britain of her best admiral. Others argue Nelson led by example. Asking his men to face death while he hid below would have been unconscionable. His visible presence inspired the fleet. That inspiration was worth the risk to him personally. Could Villeneuve have won? Almost certainly not. The Franco-Spanish fleet's problems, poor training, mixed crews, communication difficulties, undermanned ships, were structural and couldn't be overcome by different tactics. Villeneuve's best option was probably refusing battle entirely, staying in Cadiz until political circumstances changed. But Napoleon's pressure and his own desperation drove him to fight a battle he couldn't win. The battle also demonstrated the importance of training and professionalism. British crews had been at sea for months, drilling constantly, practicing gunnery until they could fire faster than any navy in the world. French and Spanish ships had spent months blockaded in port, unable to train, their crews growing rusty. When battle came, that difference was decisive. Superior training mattered more than numerical advantage. Trafalgar's influence on naval warfare lasted for generations. Nelson's aggressive tactics, seeking close action, aiming for complete destruction of the enemy rather than marginal advantage, became the Royal Navy's standard approach. British naval officers studied Trafalgar like a sacred text, learning its lessons about courage, initiative, and the value of well-trained crews. What would Nelson do? Became a question asked in every crisis for the next century. The battle's environmental aftermath was grim. After Trafalgar, a massive storm struck, driving many captured ships onto the Spanish coast, where they wrecked. Of the 18 Franco-Spanish ships captured, only 4 made it safely to Gibraltar. The rest were destroyed by the storm or retaken by Spanish forces. Hundreds more sailors died in the storm, men who'd survived the battle only to drown within sight of land. The sea off Cape Trafalgar became a graveyard. Nelson's body was preserved in a barrel of brandy for the journey home, then given a state funeral at St. Paul's Cathedral on January 9th, 1806. It was the greatest public mourning Britain had seen. Tens of thousands lined the streets. The funeral procession took hours. Nelson was interred in a sarcophagus originally made for Cardinal Wolsey in the 16th century. His tomb remains Britain's most visited military memorial, a pilgrimage site for those who revere naval tradition. The battle's legacy extends beyond naval tactics to British culture and identity. England expects that every man will do his duty became one of history's most quoted military orders. The signal represents duty, sacrifice, courage, everything Britain wanted to believe about itself. Whether that ideal was always achieved is debatable. But Trafalgar gave Britain a story of heroism that defined national character for generations. The battle also ensured British global dominance throughout the 19th century. With unchallenged naval supremacy, Britain could project power anywhere, support allies, protect trade routes, and expand its empire. India, Africa, China, the Pacific. British ships went everywhere, backed by the knowledge that no navy could challenge them. Trafalgar made the British Empire possible in its 19th century form. Yet Trafalgar couldn't end the war. Napoleon still controlled continental Europe. He'd go on to win Austerlitz months later, crushing Austrian and Russian armies in his greatest land battle. The war would continue for another decade until Waterloo finally defeated him. But Britain survived to fight that long campaign only because Trafalgar made invasion impossible and British naval power sustained the coalitions against Napoleon. If this is the kind of history that fascinates you, the decisive moments where everything hung in balance, the battles where sacrifice brought victory, the days when one man's courage changed the world, then you know what to do. This channel exists because these stories deserve to be told. What other naval battles shaped Britain? The Nile, where Nelson destroyed the French fleet in Egypt. Jutland, the Great World War I clash. The battles that made Britain rule the waves. Drop your suggestions below. Thank you for watching Britain's history. The stories that mattered, told the way they deserved.